we call Good Friday was probably, and this is an opinion, but it was probably the longest day in the earthly life of Jesus. I can't imagine any day that he had that was any longer than that. And so today I get to talk about two of my favorite topics in all the world. The Bible. I love to talk about the Bible. And the other is history. And I love history. And today we're going to combine the Bible and history to find out what happened on that Friday. You know, if you read a biography of any famous person, you know, if you read about Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., you know, those are great biographies, but a very short piece of that biography will be about their death. But in our case, in Jesus' case, do you know that there are 4 biographies written about Jesus? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we call them the Gospels. And in those 4 Gospels, about 30% of what they write, a third of what they write, is about the last week of his life, about his death. It is hands down the most influential death in history. The weekend. 3 days that changed the world. So in preparation for Easter, that's just a couple weeks away, we're doing the weekend. Today, we're going to talk about what happened on that Good Friday. Next week, we're going to talk about what happened on Saturday. Most people never talk about that. We go from Good Friday to resurrection. What happened on that Saturday? And then finally on Easter Sunday, we will talk about that resurrection. I'm going to ask you to wade through a whole lot of stuff today. Historical, biblical. And I believe if we do this, that we will come to know and to love and to admire, to have a sense of wonder. That as we move into this Easter weekend, it'll be refreshing and refreshed in our minds. Friday, the longest day that Jesus lived in the flesh. Now, you need to understand as I get into this, times are approximate because the Bible doesn't give us specific times. But we're going to begin at the end of Friday and work our way backwards to understand just what was going on. So it's Friday. We walk through the city gates. We see 3 crosses. On the outside crosses hang the bodies of 2 thieves. Now, they weren't just thieves, and I'll get into that in a bit. The middle cross, it's empty. Victim is already dead and has been taken down. But on that middle cross, as we look at it, there's a sign. And the sign says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It's written in Hebrew, or Aramaic as we come to know it, and in Latin, and in Greek. And I'm going to come back to that a little later as well. So the question we want to start with today is, how did we get here? Why did Jesus die? How did this man, this meek and mild, blesser of little children, friend of sinners, end up being executed as an enemy of the state? Well, it'll turn out that Friday was a day of mixed motives. It's odd alliances. There are secret meetings. There's politicians that are, they're doing some cynical PR ploys. And we know there's a lot of explosive emotion. Well, it's going to turn out that there will be many powerful forces, many characters at work. And they all end up crushing Jesus. But when you keep trying to understand, when we keep pushing on, it's not clear that the people who thought they were in charge on this Friday were really in charge. I want you to think about that as we go. Because everyone on Friday had an agenda. They had something they wanted to see accomplished. And we're going to walk through these events. We're going to look at these major players and their agendas and just ask the question, what do they want? What do they want? Which agenda prevailed? Whose will triumphed? Why did Jesus die? First major player we need to understand is Rome. Now, Rome was kind of behind the scenes, but Rome would say that Jesus died because he was a threat to Rome. And in any threat to Rome, you have to die. Why was he a threat? He's called Jesus Christ. Now, we do understand this morning, right? Christ is not his last name. You do get that, right? Christ came from the Greek word kreo, which means to anoint. So it meant the anointed one or the Messiah. And the notion of Messiah is very important if we're going to understand this story of Jesus. You see, there were in his day a lot of people who claimed to be Messiah. And they were going to lead a political movement. And part of that's because of our second group of influencers, and that is the crowd that was in Jerusalem. These are the Israelites that were there. They were waiting. This crowd, they're waiting for a political leader. They want somebody to come and to overthrow Rome. They want to revolt against Rome. And they want him to clean up the corruption in the temple too. Because it's under Roman power. So who's going to lead Israel into this freedom? Something else that we need to know. There were a bunch of wannabe messiahs. We never consider that, do we? Jesus, the Messiah, that's the only one we ever think about. There were many wannabe messiahs. They were all around in the first century in Jesus' day. There were different thoughts about the Messiah, what he would be. But everybody that was in Jerusalem agreed that the Messiah would be a very powerful figure who would lead Israel to freedom and overthrow Rome. That's what their concept of the Messiah was going to be. Let me just read about a couple of these wannabe messiahs found in the New Testament. Acts chapter 5, verses 36 and verse 37. Verse 36 says, some time ago, Theudas appeared claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him, and he was killed. Now, we're told about this guy named Theudas by a historian, and his name was Josephus. And Josephus tells us that Theudas was actually called Messiah. And he got a bunch of people to gather on his side. He claimed that he could part the River Jordan. He claimed that he could make the walls of Jerusalem fall. He kind of thought of himself as a New Testament Joshua. And he led a revolt. He led a revolt against Rome and ended up being captured. And Rome decapitated him in downtown Jerusalem so everybody could see what would happen if you defy Rome. Verse 37 tells us about another one. His name, Judas the Galilean. He appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Another wannabe Messiah. Read about him in the New Testament. He too was killed by Rome. Judas said, God alone is the God of Israel. Caesar is an idol. Therefore, Israel should never pay taxes. Now, I'm sure if I took a poll this morning, every one of us would like that last line, wouldn't we? Let's not pay no taxes. We could get along with that. So Judas the Galilean did this. He took up arms. He got a bunch of followers to go with him. He got captured by Rome. His followers got captured by Rome. They crucified over 2,000 people connected to that. And I want you to think about this. Judas of Galilee. Jesus was born in Nazareth in Galilee. So as a child, Jesus saw these crosses. He saw the crucifixions. He saw people hanging on these crosses as a kid. That's just crazy for me to think about. And what they're really saying is if anybody else gets any bright ideas about trying to get people not to pay taxes, Rome's got plenty more crosses. Leads to a really big question this morning. This idea of Messiah, this is a very dangerous occupation. How do you know if you're the guy? It reminds me of the story. I like the cartoon, Disney cartoon stuff, and they have this one called Sword in the Stone. Familiar with that? You know what the sword in the stone is? It's all about King Arthur, and the sword is in the stone. The one to pull the sword out of the stone is the King of England. And the only one that could pull it out was Arthur. That's what this reminds me of, because how do you know if you're the Messiah? Well, you got to be the guy that can beat Rome. How do you know if you can beat Rome? Oh, you got to go fight Rome. But here's the hard part. If you try and you don't do it, you get crucified. I mean, think about it. And if you get crucified, then you are not the Messiah. Folks, that happened time and time again. Therefore, listen, we know of at least 18 separate wannabe messiahs that were recorded for us in history. 18. And they were all crucified. Now, remember I mentioned the thief on the cross? Why would Rome crucify a thief? This was no dime store thief, guys. He wasn't up there for shoplifting. He was part of one of these anti-Roman movements that was taking place. He was crucified so Rome could send a message to everyone who was watching. But Jesus, on the other hand, he deliberately, prominently rejected the role of Messiah. One time we see him rejected very vividly. He's John chapter 11. He does this miracle where he feeds thousands of people. And he knows, because he's Jesus, he knows that the crowds intended to come and make him king by force. They want a Messiah who's going to take down Rome. But he won't do it. He withdraws to the hills all by himself. And that just frustrates the life out of people. See, it's unlike any of these other wannabe messiahs. He refuses to lift a finger against Rome. So why does he end up on the cross? Well, we have to go back a little further in the story to an earlier scene. When the chief priests bring Jesus before a man known in history as Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate. Pilate rules over Judea on behalf of Caesar. I'll tell you what, he's Caesar's lackey. That's what he is. Nothing more, nothing less. He's called, his official title is procurator. He's over Jerusalem as well. But Pilate's job is a very big headache. Nobody that was in Pilate's position wanted to be in the Middle East. They didn't want to be around Jerusalem. But what we find out about Pilate is he's a very ambitious guy. He's got to do well where he's at. But what he has to do is juggle well. Because he's got these groups of people. No, the first group is the chief priest. The chief priests are in charge of the temple. And these chief priests, they have a narrow line to walk. Because they're the guys, like I said, in charge of the temple. And if you want a word to think about their strategy for this time, is collaborate. They wanted to collaborate. Listen, they have to stay close enough to Rome so that Rome will allow them to continue to rule over the temple. But if they get too close to Rome, then the people are going to hate them. So they've got this real fine line to walk. Then there's another group of people. Pharisees. Oh, we know that word, don't we? Very seldom do we ever find a positive thought about the Pharisees, do we? Well, it continues right here. Their word for this time would be purify. Purify. You see, they believe Israel's problem is that they've neglected the Torah. If they can get a group of people who are zealous enough to obey Torah, they could purify themselves before God, and then God would honor that by destroying Rome. Sound familiar? Another group of people, zealots. Zealots. Now, some of these overlap each other. Please understand that. But they would disagree as well. The zealot strategy, theirs was fight. Let's just fight. They said, Rome is evil. Rome is bad. We ought to be courageous. We need to take up arms. And if we do that, God will bless our people and he will take down Rome. That was the thought of the zealots. Not a lot of thinking going on. But they had a lot of brawn and a lot of brute. And that's what they wanted to use. The other group opposite of them, the Essenes. The Essenes, their strategy is withdraw, pull back. You ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? You know, the scrolls that were found that just validated what we have in the Bible? They were found in a community that's called the Qumran community. It was occupied by the Essenes. Their deal was, it's not just that Romans are bad. Their thinking was the whole temple system is so corrupted because it's got Gentile involvement in it. And we're not going to have anything to do with it, so we're just going to go hide out in the mountains. But all of these groups that Pilate's working with, they all agree on one thing. Rome is evil and needs to be destroyed. So let's look at Pilate for a moment. Luke chapter 13 and verse 1. This is the guy that's going to oversee Jesus' fate. Now, there were some presidents at the time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Listen, some people came up and told Jesus about the Galileans that Pilate had killed while they were at worship. Think about it. Jesus is from Galilee, so they're trying to get him fired up. They're trying to get him ready to fight. But Pilate, by saying that Pilate mixed their blood with the blood of the sacrifices on the altar. Listen, the temple is the holiest place of all for these people. It's ground zero for Israelites' identity. And it means it was also primarily associated with a spirit of revolt and revolution against Rome. So it's really a dangerous place. And one day Pilate slaughters so many people near Samaria, there's so much unrest there, that word gets back to Caesar, and Caesar just calls him back to Rome. And that's the last time we hear of him in history. Ancient writer named Philo said Pilate's rule was marked by bribery, insults, robberies, supreme cruelty, executions without trial, and a furious, vindictive temper. And this is a man who's, this is where Jesus' life rests, with him. So the chief priests, they bring Jesus to Pilate. This is their charge. Begin to understand the whole new way of what's going on Friday, right here. They bring Jesus to Pilate. This is a charge that they make to Pilate in Luke chapter 23 and verse 2. They began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man," being Jesus, "subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, a king." Listen, the chief priests could not give a rip about paying taxes. They could care less if they paid taxes or not. As a matter of fact, they don't want to pay taxes. They're just trying to put pressure on Pilate to make Pilate do what they want him to do. They're saying this. They're saying that Jesus is a problem for Rome. Caesar wouldn't like him. You better do something. Listen, Pilate, for his part, resists the chief priest. But listen, he resists the chief priest, not out of any sympathy for Jesus. It's just the fact that the chief priest came to him and he can't stand the chief priest. So he's resisting all he can. He doesn't want to do what they ask him to do. Because if he does that, then the chief priest gets stronger. And if they get stronger, then he gets weaker. So he's not going to do what they want him to do. And so he's looking for a reason to defy. It's all about politics and power. And there's a little bit of money mixed in here too. And when Pilate finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, he thinks, ha ha ha, I'm out of it. Herod oversees Galilee. I'll send him to Herod. And Herod looks at the situation and he said, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole. So at that point, he goes back to Pilate. Pilate turns to the crowds. Some of you know the story. He says, you know, it's feast time, it's Passover, so we're going to release a prisoner for you. So let me give you a choice. We can release Jesus, who's harmless, or we can release this murderer, Barabbas. Anybody remember who the crowd says they want? Who do they want? Come on, let me hear it, crowd. You're the crowd. Who do you want? You want Barabbas. Why? He's a murderer. But he's willing to kill Rome. That's what we got to understand. He's on trial because he was one of those that was involved in an insurrection against Rome. And their thoughts are, at least Barabbas will kill Romans. Jesus won't lift a finger against them. So if we're going to let somebody go, let Barabbas go so we can kill some Romans. That's the thought process. And finally, in the famous scene, we all know this one. Pilate does what? Washes his hands. Think about it. I'm going to tell you what, a lot of us misunderstand this. It's not that Pilate has a sensitive conscience or he's worried about Jesus or thinks that Jesus doesn't deserve to die. Clearly, the whole movement against Jesus is trumped up. But let's be honest, Pilate could care less about the fate of some powerless, harmless, dime store Messiah. His agenda is to maintain the upper hand over the chief priest, over the temple. Now, of course, we understand as we look at it that Pilate, he should be in control. But the chief priest had this little trump card. This is what they say in John chapter 19, verse 12. Pilate, if you let this man Jesus go, you're no friend of who? No friend of who? Let me hear you. No friend of who? Caesar. He's no friend of Caesar's. What are they doing to him here? Because he says anyone who claims to be a king, that is Jesus, is no friend of Caesar. Now, listen, I want you to listen to these horrible, tragic words for these Jewish priests to say. In John chapter 19, verse 15, they say, we have no king but Caesar. Ouch. That's ridiculous. They hated Caesar. But yet, in order to get Pilate's attention, they made the claim that we have no king but Caesar. You know, one of the reasons that Jesus died, and we never considered this, is just very physical. Caesar needed grain. His grain came from Egypt. It came through the territory. He came through where Pilate was, and that was part of the transport. And so he needed to keep grain flowing because if you've got an empire, you've got to feed the people. You've got to feed the people. You've got to get the food to do it. And so Jesus actually died because they wanted that free trade back and forth for the grain that was coming from Egypt. And that's just something that we just never talk about. But it is so true. I don't think Caesar ever heard of Jesus. I really don't. Pilate could not risk having Caesar think that he is soft on these anti-Roman terrorists. So Pilate turns to Jesus. Simple question. Are you the king of the Jews? Folks, that is an extremely dramatic moment. Because listen, Jesus can go free if he'll say the right thing. It's ironic, earlier in Jesus' ministry, over and over people wondered about this. All Jesus had to do at some time was just say, yep, I'm the Messiah. I'm the king. And all Israel, or a good chunk of Israel, would have jumped up, they would have pulled up arms, and they would have even died for him. But he would never say, "Yep, that's me." That's what's going on Palm Sunday. Jerusalem is celebrating Passover. Passover is a very explosive topic in Jerusalem because of the Romans. It's an occupied city. It's occupied by Rome. So what do you celebrate at Passover? Well, they celebrate when this guy named Moses came into the picture and took people out of Egypt. It's a celebration of their freedom from Egypt. There's no Egypt this time. There's Rome. And so those in Rome, or those in Jerusalem of the Romans, are scared to death of what's going to happen. There's going to be an uprising. And they're going to try to reach freedom because of Passover. Now, it's Rome. The bad guy now, Caesar. Then this young leader, Jesus, comes riding into Jerusalem. And they're getting ready to celebrate Passover, celebrate freedom, get away from the Egyptians. And that's why when we walk in on Palm Sunday, they're shouting as loud as they can, "Hosanna to the Son of David, the warrior king." But Jesus won't fight. He keeps not claiming his title. Listen, you go through the Gospels over and over in the oddest ways. And listen, he'll say he's Messiah when he's in Samaria, but he won't say it when he's in Israel. And that's precisely why the crowds in Jerusalem turned on him so fast. Now, a lot of people say, well, that don't make sense that that doesn't make sense. They'd be so excited for him on Sunday and then be ready to kill him on Friday. But it absolutely makes sense. It's because on Palm Sunday they thought, here's the revolution. Here comes the warrior. Here comes the fighter. Jesus wouldn't revolt. Jesus wouldn't lift a sword. So when it's too late to save him, when there's nobody around, when he's in the hands of the chief priest and Pilate, now when there's no chance of an army rising to defend him, none of those guys are around to listen to him, Jesus finally gives a definitive answer to Pilate. When there's no chance of his word becoming misinterpreted as a military figure in a way that Jesus did not want it to be misinterpreted, he says, "Yeah, Pilate, that's me. It is as you say. I'm the one that they've been waiting for. I'm their king." Jesus knows what's going to happen. Pilate pronounces the sentence, even though Pilate really didn't want this to happen. So who's really making this happen? Well, we have to back up a little more. Why did the chief priest want Jesus dead? What's going on? Well, shortly before Good Friday, Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus did this among a lot of other miracles. People are talking about him all the time. So the Pharisees and the chief priests have a meeting. Look at what one of them says here in John chapter 11, verses 47 and 48. Here is this man, this Jesus, performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then notice this sentence. And then if the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Folks, this is not an idle fear. It's exactly what happened in 70 AD. There was one revolt, one wannabe Messiah too many. And Rome came down on Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple and obliterated the nation of Israel. They knew what was coming. And so did Jesus. Then the high priest Caiaphas, he spoke up in John chapter 11 and verse 50. He says, "You do not realize it, It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. John says Caiaphas was saying way more than what he even knew he was saying. It was better. One man was going to die for Israel. But not just for Israel, but for all the scattered people of God. See, the priests knew if unrest got too strong in Jerusalem, Rome was going to come in and destroy everything. And that's what happened. And they also knew that Jesus was not a military threat. They understood his teaching. His movement was a threat of another kind. That is Jesus, the likes of whom had never been seen before. He was claiming, he was living, he was manifesting that the kingdom of God that everybody had been waiting for was somehow present now. The love of God, the power of God, the grace of God, the salvation of God were now present on earth. It wasn't only in the temple. It wasn't in the sacrifices. It wasn't in the approach to the law that was really legalistic. And that's what separated Jews from Gentiles. It wasn't any of that. It was through Jesus. Through this one man. Through what he said. Through how he lived. Through how he loved. He was telling everybody that God's presence and God's blessing, God's forgiveness, God's guidance were now available to the world through him. Not only had no one ever done this before, no one had ever thought that before. So before the hearing with Pilate, there was another one with what was called the Sanhedrin. Kind of like Israel's Supreme Court. It's made up of basically chief priests and Pharisees, and they have Jesus arrested on Friday very, very early. They have their own little trial before they take him to Pilate. This happens, we're told, before daybreak. Probably, more than likely, illegal. Because the chief priest, the Sanhedrin, had a very delicate task in front of them. Here's the deal. Here's what they had to do. They had to get the crowds to hate Jesus, and they had to get Rome to crucify Jesus. Now, the quickest way to get Pilate to crucify Jesus was tell him that Jesus was a threat to Rome. He was a threat to Caesar. But if they tell the crowds, this, the crowds are going to love him. And so they have to come up with two charges. They charge Jesus with blasphemy so the crowds will hate him. And then they charge him with treason so Pilate will kill him because he's not a friend to Caesar. Folks, that was a very hard task. And in fact, they couldn't get it done. It was an inept trial. Mark chapter 14, verses 55 and 56 say this. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they might put him to death, but they could not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Once again, all Jesus did, he was silent. He was silent. He makes no attempt to correct the false witnesses. He makes no attempt to explain his mission correctly. He just sits silent while they mocked him. But when they ask him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he makes one statement. I am. He uses the little phrase in Greek, and in the Old Testament, it's used for the name of God. I am who I am. And then he says, you will see the Son of Man descending on the clouds. Now, when he says this, he is pronouncing his death sentence. He's not saying you're going to see a body float down from the sky. He's using an image out of the Old Testament. You now see God present and at work uniquely in me. And with that, Jesus hands them what they need for their verdict. They couldn't get any of that from the false witnesses, but Jesus hands it to them. He did their work for them. Why? Why? Let's go back a little further in time. Before the meeting with Pilate, before the trial with the chief priest, it's 2 a.m. There's a place called Gethsemane. The story of the human race begins in a garden. The first Adam is in a garden with Eve. The story of the second Adam is going to end in the Garden of Gethsemane. When Jesus is in the garden, listen, he has lots of options, right? He can fight like the zealots. He's young. He's got a lot of charisma. The crowds would follow him to death. He could do that. He could withdraw like the Essenes. He could go into the desert and start a safe little community. A lot of people would follow him to do that. He could collaborate with the chief priest. Imagine if he had a temple as a platform for his teaching. What could he do? He could try to cut a deal with Pilate. Imagine him being connected and influencing Rome from the inside. What might that do for the world? He could call to his Father. God had already done so many things through him. He could ask for legions of angels. If there was one more miracle, maybe that would rally everybody to his side. But we know Jesus does none of those things. Again, this night in the garden. Listen, whatever you believe about Jesus, whatever you believe about the Bible, whatever you believe about divinity, you got to understand this is history. This happened. This one lone, deserted, vulnerable man says, I know what I got to do. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to deal and I'm not going to dazzle. I will die. I'll die. Not my will, Father, but yours. Folks, this man, Jesus, is unbelievable. Where did he get this? If anybody in the world believed that the real messianic faith, the real messianic mission, the real messianic battle was to die out of love for others, and he does it in the most concrete ways. Listen, Jesus knows rebels always die. So he dies on a cross in place of the rebels, like Barabbas. He literally saves Barabbas' life. Jesus knows the crowds are waiting for a word from him, and they'll go and kill a bunch of Romans. A lot of Roman soldiers at that time, listen, they were just boys. They were just boys from nearby Syria working for the Roman government, so Jesus won't say a word. He goes to the cross, and he dies. And a whole bunch of people from Rome live. Jesus knows if he flees, his disciples will be gathered and executed. That's what happened to every other wannabe Messiah and their disciples. So he dies. They're saved. Jesus knows if he does say a word and the crowds follow him, then Rome will come down and destroy Jerusalem. So he dies. And he saves Jerusalem. He dies for all these people who hate him. He says, I'm going to lay down my life for people who don't understand. It's going to buy a little time. It's going to buy a little space. Little community after that will be formed. And out of sacrificial love, it can change the world. Now, here's the deal. Here's the deal. This is exactly what happened. He died. And out of his remarkable brilliance, from his breathtaking courage, from his inexplicable love, he sized up a situation that defeated every human attempt at correction. He identified exactly what would be needed to bring redemption. And it cost him everything. It cost him his life. And he turned out to be exactly right. Because more than 2,000 years later, we sit here. Pilate, Pilate, of all the people who did not intend to be anybody's mouthpiece, ends up writing. He writes it out in Hebrew, which is the language of the people of God. He writes it out in Greek, which is the language of the cultured world, and he writes it in Latin. It's the language of the Roman Empire, so that the whole world can read the gospel. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Folks, listen, Jesus outfought, he outmaneuvered, he outcrafted every group, every power, but not just that. He outloved everybody. Because Jesus in the garden had just one agenda. Everybody had an agenda that day. But his agenda was to love. And he decided that it was going to happen on that Friday. On Friday, he dies for the world. Not because of anybody else. It wasn't Pilate, it wasn't Herod, it wasn't Caesar, it wasn't the chief priest, it wasn't the crowds. As a matter of fact, John chapter 10 and verse 15 and 18, it says this: I lay down my life for the sheep. Who's ever been like this guy? No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord, and I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Wow. You see, on Friday, the one true Messiah in a world of wannabes lays down his life rather than picking up a sword. On Friday, God declared his heart for you and me. Every sinful person that's ever lived. And by the way, that's you and me. On Friday in a garden, a decision gets made. On Friday in a garden, Jesus said, I will suffer, I will die. Most importantly, I will choose love.